All right. So, today I'm going to talk about lesson number 3 from what I learned from writing my first novel-length work. And I don't know, it's one of those things where I feel like something I learned is that you can do a lot of the actual work is in the editing and not necessarily in the prep work. In writing the first draft of the novel, Pursuit of the Heliotrope, I had a full plot outline. I had character descriptions. What's this character's full name? What do they look like? How old are they? How tall are they? What are the things that they like? What's their sense of humor like? What specializations do they have, right? And I wrote these character descriptions for everybody. I had a full plot outline from start to finish. And I didn't even really push myself to write the first draft very fast. I just went back and looked at my records, and it looks like that first draft was written over the course of about 6 months. Now, I was writing other things in the meantime, so it wasn't like I was only writing that or only doing that. But at the same time, 6 months to write 50,000 words is pretty easy, honestly. If you can do 3,000 words a day, 5 days a week, 1 month would do 50,000 words, right? Something like that. 60,000 would be, right? So I was not pulling my hair out in a physical sense of stressing out over writing so much every day to get this darn thing done. I was taking a pretty careful pace. And it's worth noting that by the middle of the book, I was already kind of I'm not sure where I'm, even though I have an outline, I'm not quite sure that I'm doing my best writing. And then by the final third of the book, I was just kind of I don't know, I'm tired of writing the same thing for, days and days and days and days and days. I'm just going to get this thing out there. I'm going to look at my outline. I'm going to crunch out, a first draft of a chapter, and I'm going to move on to the next one and be done with it kind of thing. And it's funny because I thought I had done a lot of prep work, right? I thought I had come up with a really good bunch of characters. I thought I had come up with a really good outline for the plot. I had done a lot of plotting, as the constant argument is over plotting versus pantsing, right? But at the same time, the final result, while the first third of it was pretty decent, there were a lot of things that were just kind of this is boring, this is meh. Not necessarily boring, but this is average, right? This is mediocre at best kind of thing. There was a lot of that. And then the last third was this is just not particularly good. It was so significant a discovery that I kind of went away from the thing for 6 months and wrote other things, only to come back later on and start editing again. And that editing process was super long as well. It's I guess the lesson that I learned is that that even if you have good prep work, a lot of the story is going to be made in the editing process. And I think that's okay. You get that first draft done and you discover the flaws in it, right? Because when you write an outline can sound pretty decent, right? But you don't have all that connective tissue in there. And so it's very easy to say, oh, wait, once you write it out, it's very easy to say, wait, this is way too easy, or this was way too short, or, why didn't somebody do this other thing, right? And so once you have the actual piece written down, in some sense, you can start adding more to it. And that's actually, kind of what I did. The first draft, I believe, had 18 chapters, something like that, and was about 50,000 words. Then what I ended up doing is I ended up starting to add a lot more, because the thing about writing an outline is that unless you're making an extremely detailed outline, you don't really think so much about how the individual characters are going to interact with each other. You maybe have kind of a vague idea, but those little touches, like someone, blinking in disbelief when somebody else says something, or someone saying, oh yeah, this guy knows what he's doing, kind of thing, right? These are all things that probably aren't going to make it into your outline, but they really do need to make it into your final story. And so, after I finished that first draft, I started looking through it and saying, how would, Lou react to this person doing this thing? How would Wyatt talk about this particular character? How would, person A talk about person B in situation C? And, over the next couple of revisions of the book, I ended up adding another 20,000 words. It went from 50,000 to like 70,000. And even that wasn't enough, right? I added a bunch of character interactions, but what I discovered was that there were a bunch of characters who I had come up with, ideas for their character, right? But I never used it. I had a bunch of crew members of the Heliotrope who, despite the fact that I had these character descriptions and what they were good at, and despite the fact that they were in this particular situation, it was like, well, they're not doing anything, so I guess they're just not part of the story. And it's one of those things where I realized that, hey, I can totally make them do something. It's just I have to think of what they're going to do, and it's something that was absolutely not in my original outline, but it is something that I was like, I have this one chapter where we see them and they're getting hijacked and yada yada yada, and we get to see a little bit of their reaction to their very dangerous situation. But I didn't build on that anywhere else in the book, and so I ended up creating 4 additional chapters. And I said, yeah, I'm going to have 4 additional chapters for 4 of these crew members, and it's going to be when they're kind of in this situation and how they're thinking about trying to get out of it, kind of thing. And I added that. And then, I finished that, and I'm like, well, this is much better, right? I now have character interactions. I now have little tidbits of world building here and there that make, the world kind of jump out at you a little bit more than it otherwise had in the first draft. And yet, I still noticed, well, wait a minute. These characters are interacting with the main antagonist, but they're not interacting with each other. And the reason for that, of course, is that they were in a situation where it was difficult to interact with each other. But here's the thing. It was difficult for them to interact with each other, but not impossible. And it was that discovery that helped me realize that I could add a whole nother big chunk to those 4 additional chapters that would help to show the reader how each of these characters in this dire situation talk with each other, or at least try to, and kind of the plans that they're coming up with, how they interact with each other, what sense of a feeling of duty they have for each other. And there was another 10,000 words basically, and I kept adding more and more little tiny character interactions to the point where, like, characters who didn't have a whole lot to say in the first draft of the book suddenly become, actually some of my favorite characters. Where in the first draft, there's a character in the first draft. Well, so in every draft there was a character named Iggy, Iggy Trevin, I think, and he is like he's really good at finding and disarming traps. That's kind of his role in the book. And there was this whole scene of him, going through and doing his job somewhere, but there wasn't a whole lot of interaction between him and other characters. And so it was like, well, wait a minute. First off, he should be talking, he should be on the line with his boss, as they're going through this thing, trying to figure out, what their next step is, kind of thing. But then there were also little things where he could be like, yeah, these, I learn from the best, kind of thing. Make sure that Wyatt doesn't hear me say that, kind of thing. And so, I added more of that. And it was really nice to discover how each of these characters kind of went from something that had a cool, because character descriptions, in an outline form kind of thing, are very isolated, right? You might say that, this character is friends with this character, or this character is, knows this character, or, this character, whatever, right? There are all kinds of different things that you might write in one of those things, but how those relationships, like, jump out in the story, I think, is something that, even so, still wouldn't probably show up, in detail in those outlines. And so you have to think of places where, hey, this character is talking with this character, and what, is there a quirk of their interaction that I can make use of or show off to show how they, view each other, kind of thing. And so it's it's one of those things that I think was very informative, not informative, very like enlightening to me, was discovering that even though I had done a lot of work to kind of outline the story and characters and events beforehand, that even though I had done all that work, that the first draft result, while it wasn't full of like typos, I I'm too neurotic about typos to let them go even in a in a rough draft. Um, but but in the rough draft there was not a whole lot of this detail, and I think that the story was really made in the editing process, even though I had done all of that outlining, all of that character description stuff beforehand. And so, I guess my advice, or the lesson that I learned, is that even if you think you have a good outline, a good set of character descriptions, a good, whatever, number one, you're going to probably get a little bit tired of writing this thing over the course of a full novel-length work, right? If you have an idea for a short story, you can bang that thing out in one day. Easy peasy. Maybe two if it's a longer short story. If you have an idea for a novelette or a novella, you can pop one of those out in a week if you really know what you're doing, right? Or maybe 2 weeks, or a little more than that. Plus, just to get a solid draft down, right? And those stories are often a little bit more like action oriented. Like there's a very short series of events that's happening, and I want this to happen and this to happen and this to happen, and you can almost hold those details in your head when the work is short enough. But for a novel length work, it, at least for me, is too difficult to hold all those details in my head at once. And so I wrote them down beforehand, most of them, right? And then I wrote something down that was based on the outline that I had made, and I discovered that, well, it had very little insight to the characters or the world that they're in, because those details weren't in the outline. That just wasn't there. The plot was in the outline, and the plot was there. It's just that there was a lot of missing interactions and stuff. And so, I mean, I guess the lesson is that for novel-length works, for longer works, the longer the work is, the more likely it is that you're not going to be at your top inspired condition for writing the whole thing. You're going to end up writing on days where you're like, I don't care, I'm just going to get this thing out, But at the same time, even if that happens, you still have the option to look at that, and I feel like this is super obvious, but like it is still something that I kind of that was highlighted. Maybe not something that I learned, but something that was really highlighted to me in the process of writing this book is that once you've got the rough draft, you have the rough draft, but you can certainly add more things to it. You can certainly change things around, and I did a lot of that. So I guess it's one of those things where, if you are in the habit of writing kind of by the seat of your pants, you are already good at looking at your work after you've done a rough draft and saying, oh, I'm going to add this, oh, I'm going to add this, oh, I'm going to add this. But one of the downsides of being a planner, a plotter, is that you can sometimes feel too attached to your original outline. You say, well, I did it like this. If I want to add something to this, I'm going to have to rethink a bunch of other stuff, and I'm going to have to add some references to it here. I'm going to have to do a setup and a payoff, yada, yada, yada. And it's very easy to say, well, it wasn't in the outline, so it's, and the outline was good, so this is probably fine. But at the same time, I think that's a mistake. I think that for a novel-length work, you're going to find that some days you just were not on your best game, and you're going to want to rewrite those parts pretty significantly. If you have a good outline for the plot, there's going to be a lot of details missing that you're going to want to add later on, especially on the parts of the writing where you weren't at your peak form those days. Because it's going to be very easy for you to look at your outline and just blah 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 blah. Whereas when you're really on peak, in peak form, you're going to naturally look at your outline and you're going to naturally write something that has some of those interactions. But the thing about characters is that you can almost always add a little bit more of that stuff, and people will usually like it. At least I do. So yeah, that's lesson number 3. You know, I added chapters, I added character interactions, I added world building details, I added little asides from a character of saying, oh yeah, this is what I really think, but don't let so and so know about it. I added additional interactions between characters that didn't have any interaction in the first draft at all. I significantly changed some of the interactions between characters and the antagonist because, my first draft of those extra 4 chapters, right? That's the crew of the Heliotrope talking with the antagonist. What I discovered after writing those was that all 4 of them kind of sounded a little bit too many. They all sounded too much the same. There were 4 different people having an interaction with one guy, right? The antagonist is this guy, and they each interacted with him in a fairly similar way. And I said, after I finished that draft, I was like, well, wait a minute, it's good the way that it is now. They're all interacting with him in a reasonable way, but if I'm really thinking carefully, they all have backgrounds that should cause them to interact with him in slightly different ways. They all have different quirks of personality that I can add in and have them react in different ways or interact in different ways, or have a quip here where another person just stays silent. And that added a lot more color to those characters who didn't have really a part in the book in the first draft, and now they're actually, I think, really really well fleshed out. Like MacDonald Martin, and it's Martin, not Martin. There's a bit of that in the book, but he's an engineer on the Heliotrope, and his reaction to the picker captain, I think, is one of the things that I really enjoyed writing, because it was a lot of he reacts a lot differently than the other characters do, and a little bit more emotionally, and I thought it was I thought it was a fun little section of the book. That is lesson number 3 from my first novel. Even if you've made a good plan, sometimes the best stories are made in the editing. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you are writing something or something like that, I hope these lessons give you at least a little bit of food for thought. And if you're a reader, I hope that this gives you kind of an insight into what the process of writing a book is like, and maybe helps you, I don't know, think a little bit more nuancedly or deeply about what it's like to, about stories that you're reading. So I hope it's helpful for everybody. Anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you next time with, I don't know what. Anyway. Oh, no, I do know what. I almost forgot to say it. I was thinking about doing this, and I put the things down on a piece of paper, and I set it in a stack, and it got covered by other things. But I'm going to do another video later this week, probably Friday, of all the really goofy ideas I came up with for the title of the book before I settled on Pursuit of the Heliotrope. And I think you will enjoy that, especially if you want a good laugh at the really bad title ideas that I came up with. So that is something that we'll have probably Friday, possibly Monday, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Have a good week.